Hello and welcome. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to see how many people have shown up for our webinar this morning. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the importance of values. My name is Jay Blythe. I'm the Director of Consulting here for Barratt Values Centre, and it's my pleasure to be with you all today to introduce Richard Barratt. As many of you will know, and it's my pleasure to introduce him to those of you who are new to his work, Richard is an internationally recognised thought leader on the evolution of human values in business and society. He's the founder and chairman of the Barratt Values Centre. He's a fellow of the World Business Academy and former values coordinator at the World Bank. Richard is also the author of several books, including The Values-Driven Organisation, A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing, and Evolutionary Coach. In his most recent book, Everything I've Learned About Values, Richard condenses his wisdom from many years into the slim read, and it is the focus of our time together today. So this session, we're going to start with a presentation by Richard, in which he's going to be addressing a lot of the questions that you've posted when you registered for this webinar. I noticed a fair few of you posted questions as well about organisational and society, and we're focusing on personal values in this webinar. So for those of you that did that, Tracy, Iman, Jerry, just to name a few of you, please look out for the details you'll get at the end of this webinar about the next webinars we're doing to address those questions. As we're going through the presentation today with Richard, as additional questions rise, please feel free to post those in the chat box, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome you, Richard, my esteemed colleague, to this session and hand over to you.
Well, hello everybody. I gather people from all over the world, so I send my best wishes no matter where you are. I'm going to dive right into the presentation this morning, which will be on the importance of personal values. So here we go. Now, this is the book. It took me about a year to write it. It usually takes me a year to write a book, and it was inspired by a friend of mine, and you'll see that in the foreword, from Sweden, who said, you know, Richard, he said, when I listen to you, it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose. Why don't you make it a bit simpler and write a little book that clarifies everything and puts down all the main points about values? And so I thought, wow, you know, that's an idea. So that's what I did. I'm glad I listened to him. Thank you, Bjorn. So let me move on to the next slide. I'm technically challenged a little bit at the moment. Let me just find out how to do that. I think if I just click, that should do it. Whoops, why? Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry. Okay. So first question is, what are values? Whoa, what are values? I used to call it a shorthand way of describing our individual and collective motivations and what's important to us. But over time, I realized that values are more than that. They're the energetic drivers of our aspirations and intentions, because you know, our values are really important to us, and so we are driven by whatever we value. Now, some people also talk about virtues, and what's the difference? Well, virtues are values that are held in high regard by a specific culture, religion, or spiritual philosophy. And their purpose is to create harmony. So if you look back historically, you find in different periods of history and in different religions, different virtues. So basically, virtues are contextual and they change over time. Now, values can be positive or potentially limiting. What do I mean by that? Well, you can have positive values. We all know positive values: trust, creativity, passion, honesty, integrity, clarity, things of that nature. But have you ever thought about these values? Bureaucracy, power, blame, greed, hierarchy, status seeking. Well, you're perhaps surprised to hear me say I call these values. Well, the values, because if you didn't value the behaviors associated with these words, they wouldn't be values. So these values are potentially limiting values. In other words, they may be very limiting, or they may be only slightly limiting. For example, with bureaucracy in an organization, you need a little bureaucracy in order to make things work. But when company becomes too bureaucratic, then it becomes a limiting value. So greed, on the other hand, I think is always a potentially limiting value. Hierarchy, yeah, in some situations it's positive, but in most situations it's a potentially limiting value. So today I'm going to make a distinction between stages, levels, and worldviews. We grow in stages of development. We operate at levels of consciousness, and we live inside worldviews. Well, what does all that mean? Well, I'm going to explain that in a moment. But basically, if you think about it, let's say there are 7 stages of development, and the individuating stages in your 30s, for example. But you can be in your 30s and then suddenly lose your job, lose all your money, and drop down to the survival level of consciousness. So you're operating at the survival level even though you're at the individuating stage of development. Now, what's a worldview? We all live inside worldviews, and we have worldviews. So basically there are 9 different worldviews that have appeared so far on the planet over the past 10,000 years. And these worldviews describe how a group of people live together, what's important to them in their collective beliefs and values. Now, you can live, for example, in a particular country which has a particular worldview, an average set of values, if you like, that define the worldview of that particular country. And you can notice this, for example, if you're in North Korea, that's one worldview. If you're in USA, that's another worldview. And if you live in Sweden, that's another worldview. Now, you as an individual can have your own worldview, and that can be higher or lower than the worldview of the country in which you live. So I'm going to be dealing with that topic much later in this series, in the third seminar. So let's move forward a little bit and talk about levels of consciousness. So all things being normal, the level of consciousness we operate from will correspond to the stage of psychological development that you've reached. Okay, so here are the 7 levels of human consciousness. Survival consciousness, staying alive, physically healthy by getting your survival needs met. Relationship consciousness, feeling loved by developing a sense of belonging and shared identity with others. You see, I'm describing here the levels on this 7 levels model, as it's called, which I developed over 20 years ago now. Then we get to self-esteem consciousness, feeling recognized and accepted for who you are in the communities that you belong to. You want to feel accepted, and you want to feel recognized for who you really are. So next comes the transformation level of consciousness, where you begin to let go of the fears that you learned as you were moving through the first 3 stages of development. So it's about finding out who you really are. And then once you begin to let go of the cultural conditioning, you get to the stage of internal cohesion. You're looking for meaning and purpose in life by expressing your unique gifts and talents. And at level 6, we move on to connecting with others to actualize your purpose and meaning. I call this level making a difference, but people often make a difference at different stages of development, but what's driving that making a difference can be quite different. I'll explain more about that in a moment. And then lastly, service, using your skills and talents to contribute to the good of humanity and future generations. So these are the 7 levels of consciousness. So you can find out, what levels of consciousness you're operating from by going to valuecenter.com/PVA and actually doing a self-assessment. You pick 10 values that are important to you, and you get back a diagram showing what levels of consciousness these values are at, and a description of your personality. If you've not done this, I encourage you to do it. To date, over 500,000 people have done the personal values assessment. It's free. And I'll be showing you the results of those 500,000 people in a moment. So on the one hand, we've got levels, and on the other hand, we've got stages, okay? And I'm now going to move into stages and talk about those. Before I do that, I'm going to look at the values of humanity. What do I mean by that? These are the 500,000 people who have done the personal values assessment. Now, as I click each, what you're going to see here are the top 10 personal values of these 500,000 people. As I click each button, you'll see the value come up. It's family is the #1 value, and it's at the relationship level of consciousness. Humor and fun comes #2, and that's at the 5th level of consciousness. Caring, again, at the relationship level of consciousness. Respect, also at level 2. And friendship, also at level 2. So this is very interesting. Look, what we're noticing is there's a lot of value. The top values are actually showing up at that relationship level of consciousness. Now let's look what happens next. Whoa, so now we have trust. That's a level 5 value. Enthusiasm is a level 5 value. Commitment is a level 5 value. And creativity. So this is very fascinating. You see, what's happening here is that out of this 500,000 people, what we see is they focus on their relationship values first, and then on their self-actualization values, or shall I put it this way? These are the values that they aspire to have, which are and show up in their lives. Trust, enthusiasm, creativity, and commitment. And lastly, #10, continuous learning. So these are the top 10 values. And these people who did these surveys came from all over the world. They weren't just from organizations. They were people from all lines of all walks of life, basically. So what can we say? So 5 of the top values are about how we relate to people in our lives: family, caring, respect, friendship, and trust. And 4 of these are at the relationship level. This suggests that interpersonal safety is a fundamental priority for most people. And my research backs this up, other research, which I will speak about in the 3rd seminar. So we focus on how we relate to other people. Now, 4 of the top values are about how we relate to ourselves, who we are. These are humor and fun, enthusiasm, commitment, and creativity. 4 of these are at the internal cohesion level of consciousness. This suggests that self-expression is also a fundamental priority. So will we prioritize interpersonal safety over self-expression? Only when we feel safe do we feel free to express who we are. So these results suggest that Maslow's theory is correct. We prioritize safety, a deficiency need, over self-actualization, a growth need. Furthermore, the ability to develop and grow through continuous learning is of significant importance to us. Remember, it was the #10th value, but that's very important. We all want to grow and develop, and we cannot grow and develop unless we feel safe, unless we have those level 2 values in place. Once we feel safe, then self-actualization becomes our main priority. If we want to build a positive future for everyone, we must create the conditions that allow people to feel safe, especially our children, and support everyone in their self-expression. That's what I draw from this research on the 500,000 people who did the personal values assessment. So, well, let's talk more about values. Maslow's had a hierarchy of needs, and so that's closely linked to values, because whatever you need is what you value. In other words, our values are an expression of our needs. So whatever needs you have, you value. For example, one of my #1 values is clarity. I need clarity in order to do what I do. I love clarity. It's one of my top values. So our needs, stroke values, change according to the stage of psychological development we've reached. So as we grow through life, and move through the different stages of psychological development, our needs change and our values will change. Now, you will have some values that will stay the same, but there are some important values which will change as you move through the stages. So let's look at these stages of development. There are 7 stages of development, matching the model. And it's basically a personal journey. Everybody on the planet is following this journey, although many, many people get blocked at what I call the differentiating stage. So there's the surviving stage, 0 to 2 years old. 3 to 7 is the conforming stage, and from 8 to 24 is the differentiating stage. These are the stages of ego development, and they correspond to our physical, mental development. For example, the baby let me put it another way. The dominant mind in the baby is a reptilian mind brain. It doesn't have a limbic mind brain, which is fully developed until it gets to 2. So the body mind dominates up to the age of about 18 months and 2 years. Then the limbic mind brain, or the emotional mind, takes over as the dominant mind brain until we get to about 7 or 8, when the neocortex becomes dominant, and that corresponds to the differentiating stage. As I said, these are stages in ego development. Now we move into what I call the individuating stage, roughly 25 to late 30s, where this is this bridge between the ego stages of development and the soul stages of development. And this is where we begin to let go of our cultural conditioning and release the mask that we've been wearing to get our needs met inside the framework of our existence. Now, as I said, many people never get past this stage. The majority of the people never get into this stage because they live in repressive regimes, or they live in poverty, and they're focused always on those first 3 levels of consciousness, or stages, the levels of consciousness which correspond to the first 3 stages of development. However, once you get through the individuating stage, you've had a good education, you've maybe traveled abroad, you can move on to the self-actualizing stage, where you begin to find your self-expression, into the integrating stage, where you begin to connect with other people so you can make a difference, and then finally the serving stage, where you just want to make a contribution for humanity. Now, I'm going to describe these stages in more detail, but before I do that, I think we'd like to do a little exercise, and the exercise is about, who am I? Really, who am I? Okay, so this is the exercise. You can find on your screen a little hand. It's somewhere, an orange hand. Okay, so I'm going to make a statement. If this statement is true for you, I want you to click that hand. Okay? And
can I just say that the hand is on the control panel. You've got 3 circular buttons: a microphone, a camera, and a hand is the one that's under the camera. That button.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. I'm going to ask Jay to, count the hands. I don't know how many people roughly we have in the room, but Jay, I'd like you to calculate the sort of percentage of hands that go up. Roughly when I make these statements. So I'm going to make a statement. If it's true for you, hand goes up. Okay, you ready? I have a television. Hands up. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just having a look. There are still some hand movements, some ups and downs. So I have a television. It's looking about 60%.
Okay, right.
Yep.
Next question. Can we, we'll automatically drop the hands for you, okay?
Yep.
So now I have a television down. Now we're going to I am a television.
We have some hands up. We have probably, I would say, 5%.
Good. I've never met a television in human form, but that's good to know that there are such forms available. Okay, so I have an ego is the next statement. Hands up. I have an ego.
Okay. This looks like it's 90. That's about at least 90% of hands. Yeah.
All right, let's take them down. That was I have an ego. Now, I am an ego.
Just a few more than we had for I'd say maybe 10%.
10.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, now, 2 more questions and then we're done. I have a soul.
So there's still more appearing. I would say 95%.
Okay, down hands. We did I have a soul. Now, I am a soul.
And this is looking like, I'd say our participants, I'd call that 90-95% as well. Yeah. Just taking a visual.
Okay, well that's interesting, isn't it? Look, I mean, looks like there's a lot of confusion. You know whether you are a television or you have a television, but you don't know whether you have a soul or you are a soul. Now, I have done this exercise tens and tens of times over the past 2 or 3 years, and it's always the same result. People put their hands up, I have a soul, and they put their hands up, that I am a soul. Well, so what's my opinion about that? Well, here we go. We don't have an inner core, a higher self, or a soul. We are the inner core. We are the higher self. We are the soul. Think about that. That actually changes everything in your life. I am a soul. When my ego surrenders to my soul, I will find fulfillment in my life. Important to get that understood before we now go into the stages of psychological development, and then we'll come, the seminar part will come to an end. Yeah, go ahead.
We've had a few questions come in, Richard, and sort of around the stages and soul and purpose and things. So I just wanted to put these into the room as part of the session. Okay, so Anashri says the relationship between values and development stage. So I think we were looking at that, perhaps, and covered that with the question about stages, the slide about stages. Maria wanted to know more about comparing to science and how the human functions. And I noticed you were talking about the stages of brain development, so I think that was about that one. And then Marianne is asking, what is the connection between values and life purpose? And Amelia is saying, what is the connection between values and soul?
Okay, well, lots of interesting questions to cover. I'll cover the last one first, and then we'll, through the remainder of the presentation, I'll cover the others. So the values and the soul. You see, for the first 3 stages of development, roughly up to the age of about 24, 25, we learn how to be in the world through our beliefs. So we make decisions based on our beliefs. Now, as the world we live in becomes more complex, some people call it VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, our beliefs are not good decision-making tools. We need something deeper. And so what we find is that the deepest values we have are actually the values of our soul. They're universal to all of humanity, the values of the soul. So these are the deep values that allow us to express ourselves, like creativity, connect with other people, trust, and values that allow us to contribute. So when we move through the 4th stage of development into the 5th, 6th, and 7th, we will begin to operate from values. And I cover that piece in the book. And what I say about that is that values unite and beliefs separate. So when you're operating from the lower levels of consciousness or stages of development, you operate from beliefs, and they tend to separate people. So you can get a bunch of clerics from different religions in the same room, ask them to come to an agreement about their beliefs, and they never happen. Now you ask those same clerics to come to an agreement about their values, and they'll probably come to agreement very, very quickly. So the beliefs separate, values unite. So let me now describe these 7 stages and hopefully bring a little more clarity to the questions. And if you don't get clarity, well, put your hand up and we'll try and get it for you. Okay, so the first stage is surviving. You know, actually the reptilian mind brain forms after 3 months of gestation in the womb. Now, the soul mind is the first mind. It incarnates into the embryo. It actually guides the embryo to its development, because actually DNA is an energetic guidance system, because everything in the world is energetic. And so for the first 3 months, while the embryo is growing and developing a reptilian mind brain, the soul is really the dominant mind, if you like, of the embryo. And then the reptilian mind brain forms around 3 months of gestation, and the soul becomes the subconscious of the reptilian mind brain. And that reptilian mind brain goes on dominating, learning how to keep the body alive until around the 18 months or 2 years, when the limbic mind brain, which has been developing in the background, takes over. But let's just look now at the surviving stage. So I call it infancy to 2 years of age. The motivation is basically staying alive, getting your physiological needs met: food, warmth, liquids, and a clean bottom, basically. And what the baby is at this stage is learning how to manage its environment, because when it cries out, it has a need. And if their parents are attentive, they will look after that need. And the baby learns subconsciously that the world is a loving place, that when it has a need, it gets its needs met. Now, if you are a baby to parents who are not particularly attentive, you will cry for a long time when you're hungry or you're dirty or whatever. And you begin to develop the belief, subconscious belief, that the world is not a loving place, that it is you need to be in control. And this is where, you know, later on in life, people who want to control other people, this is where that comes from. They did not have, they weren't well cared for as children during this stage of development. So let's move to the next stage. I call it the conforming stage. It's about from 3 to 7. It's about keeping safe. Now you realize as a child that you're able to survive, or you might have difficulty, but anyhow, you've got past that stage. Now you want to keep safe, and the limbic mind brain, or the emotional mind, is all about finding ways to keep safe. And that, to keep safe, you have to be loved. So it's about learning to be loved and doing what is necessary to be loved. You need to feel acceptance and a sense of belonging. Now, many people have what is known as the critical mind. It's that little mind that niggles us and says, well, you're not as good as you should be, or you're not very lovable, etc., etc. This is the period when that critical mind begins to form. Because what happens is that when your needs for love and acceptance and belonging are not met, you get angry. When needs are not met, we get angry, and the ego gets angry, but it realizes that if it gets angry towards the parents who are not meeting its needs, it maybe won't get those needs met more in the future. They won't be met at all. And so the ego begins to think, well, I must be the problem. and the critical mind begins. And that's where it comes from. It comes from the fact that you are angry, you can't get your needs met, the anger is turned inwards. Then we move to the differentiating stage. This is from 8 to 24, and this is really about feeling secure in your peer group. You want to feel a sense of recognition, and you want to belong, but not in the home. I mean, in the home you want to belong, but it's in a wider, it's at school, and it's as you leave school, it's in your workplace, you want to feel recognized. And you need to be part of a group. Now, you know, there are so many school killings by 17 or 18-year-olds in America. I know it's got a lot to do with the accessibility of guns, but these are kids who are not getting their recognition needs met, either at home or in the school. They're loners, they may be bullied, etc., and their parents don't give them enough recognition, and they get so angry that they take it out on everybody. So this is a very important stage. They're all important stages. Now we move to the individuating stage. Now I forgot to say that at that last stage, differentiating stage, the neocortex now becomes the dominant mind brain, the rational mind. So when the rational mind becomes dominant, the emotional mind becomes the subconscious, the body mind becomes the unconscious, and the soul mind becomes the super unconscious. So if you were aware of your soul through these earlier stages, this is the point where you begin, the soul disappears out of your life, only to come back again later if you get through the stages of psychological development. So individuating is 25 to 39, and it's all about releasing the fears that you learned during those first 3 stages about getting your being able to survive, feeling safe, and feeling secure. So you conformed, or you lived, you were conditioned during those first 3 stages. Now it's about letting go of your conditioning so that you can actually release your fears, feel responsible, accountable for your life, and to do that you need freedom and autonomy. And this is what the Arab Spring was about. It was a lot of people in their late 20s and 30s who had a good education, had reasonable jobs, and were coming up against a repressive regime which wasn't allowing them to individuate, and so they took to the streets. Now we move to the self-actualizing stage. This is the roughly 40 to 49, and if we've successfully individuated, we will move smoothly into self-actualizing stage. And this is about self-expression, truly about self-expression, being who you really are, becoming fully that person, and finding a need for meaning and purpose. Now, women have a particular difficulty at this stage because they may have a husband who they care for, they may have children they care for, and they may have aging parents who they need to look after. And so they tend to put themselves last. And this failure to self-express can lead to breast cancer. I've looked at the data, and it's in another book that I've written, A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing, and it's interesting that breast cancer takes off in the late 40s in terms of the incidence of breast cancer. And in that book, I discuss the leading causes of death and link them to the stages of development. So this is this also links to the chakra system. So the 5th chakra is the throat chakra on the upper chest, which again is the region of the breasts, let me put it that way. So now we move to the next stage, integrating. This is 50 to 59, and this is about connecting in unconditional loving relationships and desiring to make a difference. Now, men have a particular difficulty at this stage because when they were 2, 3, 4, 5, they got the message they had to be strong, they shouldn't show their feelings, and so they closed down on their feelings. And so when they get to the integrating stage, they're not very good at connecting, and this leads to prostate cancer. I won't say any more about that. That's a whole different topic, but it's in my book, A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing. And then lastly, serving. This is the stage where you just want to contribute, basically. You know, you don't really care about anything else other than making a contribution. It's selfless service and it's compassion with 2 S's, not 1. I'll make that change sometime. So that's what the serving stage is about, and it's above 60 years old. So here's my point. If you want to find well-being in your life, you must focus on the primary motivation of the stage of development you're at, because your well-being is dependent on satisfying the needs of the stage of development you're at. So the baby can have a sense of well-being because its needs are taken care of, and the young child can have a sense of well-being because its safety needs are met, and the young woman or the teenager, male or female, if they get the respect and recognition, they will feel a sense of well-being, and so it goes on. So all of these are different needs, and when these needs are met, we experience the feeling of well-being. And I do a 4-day workshop on this topic in Tuscany twice a year. So what's holding you back? What prevents you from mastering all of these needs, these primary needs? I call them secondary motivations. So if you have fears about getting your basic needs met, level 1, 2, 3, you will not be able to self-express. In other words, if you have difficulty surviving, how are you going to self-express? You'll be so cautious because you learned fear-based beliefs about surviving, so you won't take risks and fully express who you are. Now, if you've got fears about being loved and accepted, you won't be able to connect. In other words, if you learned fears about not being loved at 2 to 8, when it comes to the integrating stage in the 50s, you will have a lot of difficulty passing through that stage of development and connecting with others. And if you've got fears about your self-worth, a lack of self-confidence, the 3rd stage of development, you'll find it difficult to serve others because you won't have the confidence to go out and actually make a contribution. So as you see, these first 3 stages of development are actually intimately linked to the second half of our lives. So summary, if your ego has fears about surviving, you won't be able to self-express. If your ego has fears about keeping safe, you won't be able to connect. And if your ego has fears about feeling secure, you won't be able to contribute. A failure to master the ego stages of development results in mental and physical disorders at the soul stages of development. And I've indicated what all of those difficulties are, both mental and physical, in the book I mentioned, A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing. So that's it for now. We're into question time. Over to you, Jay.
You're muted, Jay.
Doesn't work if you're muted, does it?
No, I found that out almost every day.
Sorry, everyone. So the whole point of this webinar is self-expression. So we're just underlining that by a technical fault there of being muted. Okay, we have some great comments and appreciation coming in through the chat box for this webinar and everything that's being shared. And there are a few questions around age. So I'm going to throw them out there one at a time, but keep your questions coming in if there are other things you want to inquire into, because we have still got 20 minutes together. So 2 questions from Uma. 1, can people cross stages of development earlier than the said ages for each stage? And if we deal with her questions together. 2, is it possible to train us to keep the soul connection conscious as we grow up?
Great questions. I always get the first question. It's like, I want to get there faster. I want to get there faster. Okay.
Yeah, and actually I think the other age questions pick up on that as well. So maybe we should deal with all of that together. So
sure.
How do people's mental age impact and potentially conflict with the stages of physical age? Actually, no, sorry, it's a separate question. So stick with the first one. Yeah.
So I get that question all the time. And so people want to say, oh, I'm a 26-year-old and I want to make a difference in the world. I must be at I must be at the integrating stage of development. Wrong. Because you have to look at what is the motivation for the making a difference, okay? And the ego wants to make a difference. The soul wants to connect. That's a very interesting difference too. But at the individuating stage, that 26 to 30-year-old who wants to make a difference is motivated quite a lot by ambition. They want to make a difference because it's part of that stage of development of wanting to get on in the world and prove themselves and have freedom to show who they are. Whereas when you get to the individuating stage, which I call, when you get to the integrating stage, which is where I talk about making a difference level of consciousness, the motivation there is from empathy. It's a completely different motivation for making a difference. And that's critical. So, you know, I have some young friends in their 20s who I know are actually in the audience, and we've had these discussions many times, and finally they go, yeah, you're right. You know, here I am, I'm wanting to make a difference, but actually it's about righting wrongs. You know, this is wrong with the world, so we're going to right the wrong and make a difference, or I need to make a difference because it's going to be good for my self-esteem. I'll feel good about it. It's not about, I feel a deep sense of empathy with these people and I want to make a difference in their lives. So the point is, you all go through these stages. You can't rush these stages. They are seasons of our lives that we all go through. And so what was the second part of that question?
Thank you, Richard. Is it possible to train us to keep the soul connection conscious as we grow up?
This is it is, but it all comes down to the education system. The education system doesn't train us. You know, basically, it's a well-known piece of research that says 98% of 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds are creative geniuses. You know, when you get to 10, it's 35%. When you get to 16, it's 18%. And when you get to 20, only 2% of the world has genius level creativity. Why? Because it's actually taken out of us by our school system. Our school system, it trains us to be homo economicus. It doesn't train us to be souls. And so if we can change the education system so that young children learn, to fully express who they are, not be fitted into a box, or you have to learn this, you have to learn that. No, to fully express who they are, to connect with the other children in their class through values-based education, by the way, through values-based education. And then to contribute together, for the classroom to learn how to contribute something to help old people or whatever. So if we change the education system to focus on self-expression, connection, and contribution, we'd live in a very, very different world.
Thank you, Richard. The other age questions, which is relation of personal values to age. I think we've covered them. I think we've covered them in the way you've answered those questions. So there are questions coming in about leaders and organizations, and we will respond, but not in this webinar, as we're sticking to the topic of personal values. And people asking for more information about the Tuscany workshop, which we can definitely provide. How can we support leaders? Ruth would like to know, are there references to the scientific research in the book?
Okay, so in this book, it is not an academic book, it's a short book that summarizes everything I've learned about values, whereas A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing is like a 300-page book, which is quite academic, but very clear. Jay is going to produce one from Asmagic.
Somewhere. This one.
Yeah, That's like a 300-page book, which it goes into a vast amount of detail and is, answers a lot of more of those detailed questions.
Yeah. And I particularly suggest those people, there are questions, people talking about the chakra zones. Is this the same as chakra zones? There are people commenting about the male-female relationship to body parts and health and activation of the soul. And that is the book that goes into that in a lot more detail. Let me put that back on camera.
Let me say, Jay, if I may interrupt, the reason I wrote that book was to bring the soul back into psychology. In Maslow's day, and before that in Carl Jung's day, and Roberto Assagioli, they all had a cosmology of psychological cosmology which was basically accepted this idea of the soul. And from 1960s onwards, the soul went out of psychology because we went into behavioral world. And why? Because science does not accept the idea of the soul. I'm going to give you a little demonstration of what I mean. Not a demonstration, I'm going to tell you a little story. You know the exercise we did. I have a soul, I am a soul, etc., etc. I first did that exercise at ESADE Business School in Barcelona almost 3 years ago at a conference on creativity, spirituality in management. And fortunately I had the opening keynote. And I did that exercise for the first time. I was really taking a risk. It's what my soul told me to do, and I did it. And it got exactly the same results. And so I said exactly the same thing. You're a bit confused. Do I have a soul or am I a soul? The next presenters who came on to the stage were two well-known neuroscientists from the USA. And their opening slide said some of the assumptions we make in neuroscience. And the first or second assumption was there is no soul. The whole audience looked at them, and they looked at the audience and said, we might have to revise that. Because the whole audience had said, 98%, I have a soul or I am a soul. So you see, science took the soul out of psychology. And what I wanted to do was put it back in again, basically.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and that's on behalf of many of us, grateful that it's coming back in. And we are seeing people talking about the soul more in the workplace. But let's stick with the questions that we're getting in here. How does Steiner education fit with Barrett values? Andrew would like to know.
Brilliant. Lines with it very, very much. The Steiner education system is one that I highly recommend because it does treat, it's very child-centered. In other words, if your child wants to express in dance, or if your child wants to express in some other way, it picks up on that. And so it's one of the better systems for child education, I believe.
Yeah, and just to acknowledge Isabel, who made that comment in the chat box as well, that it's an education that allows for this wider understanding of self. Angelica would like to know, for adults who didn't get secure childhood from their parents and environment, how can they catch up on the individuating stage or even self-actualization?
This is where we get into personal mastery, and it's about learning to let go of the identifying and learning to let go of this, what are called early maladaptive schemas. Now, Jay, you've been on our workshop in Tuscany and we took you through that, and you experience this idea of, oh, wow. I mean, everybody has these early maladaptive schemas. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's the intensity which can really stop you from individuating. But you have to identify them. Once you've identified and named them, then you can work with them. But until you do that, they're just like thoughts in your mind which you're not able to fully appreciate. And what happened was your brain was hardwired into those limiting beliefs, because your brain was growing and developing during those first 3 stages of development. And so your experiences became hardwired. And now, those hardwired means deep beliefs or synaptic connections. You have to undo those. And it's not easy, but it is possible. And sorry, go ahead, Jay.
No, I didn't want to interrupt.
Well, you did very successfully.
I did interrupt, and I apologise to everyone for interrupting.
It's okay.
There was sorry everyone. There was a comment earlier in the chat box which asking what's the difference between beliefs and principles, and I just want to check in with you that the response that I gave to that chat exchange, because you were in flow there, was right, which is that around that beliefs, principles are those beliefs we're conscious of that we're choosing to act by, but beliefs can be unconscious as well. So it links in with what you're talking about, beliefs being formed and being lived out unconsciously.
In fact, many of our beliefs are subconscious, but we are controlled by them.
But the distinction between principles and beliefs, how would you clarify that?
Principles are basically operating beliefs that in a particular situation, and a principle can transcend many contexts. So that's, people often say, well, that's one of my principles. Okay, well, okay, is it a belief? Is it a value? Well, what is the principle they're talking about? It's like, okay, well, you could say gravity is a principle. Things always fall downwards. Okay, fine. But it doesn't tell us much about values, and it doesn't tell us much about behaviors. It just tells us about more of a deep-seated belief that something that's important is a principle.
But as deep-seated, it's held up as consciously. That's my principle. I'm aware of it.
Yeah, it's not deep-seated in the sense it's unconscious or subconscious. It's I'm aware of it, and I'm going to tell you my principles right now.
And there's a strong attachment. Yeah.
Okay. There's a strong attachment because they seem to have worked in the past, so they assume they'll work in the future.
Yeah. Ruth would like to ask you, do you think the average person is aware of their values and are living them in congruence?
No. I wasn't. None of us are. We get to the age of 24 and we learn. Our brain, our mind learns through the formation of beliefs. I'm writing a new book called Evolutionary Dynamics, where the source code of human motivation, where I'm actually exploring this idea that that we learn through our beliefs. It's a normal learning system for somebody who believes they're living in a three-dimensional material world, and it's the ego perspective. Actually, we're living in a fourth-dimensional energetic world which contains the three-dimensional material world, and if you want to live in that world successfully, the four-dimensional energetic world successfully, you need to operate from values, not beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Richard. And Joanna would like you to talk a little more about our values being our unconscious human operating system.
They can be unconscious and they can be conscious. The most important thing is to bring them into consciousness. That's what the individuating stage is about. It's about letting go of your beliefs and bringing your values into your conscious awareness. And one of the things that valuecenter.com/PVA does, if you go on and do the personal values assessment, that's one of the things it does. You're asked to pick 10 values that are important to you, and then there's an algorithm that writes a description of who you are, and people say, oh my God, that is just me. It's exactly me. And what that does is it brings values into your awareness. Now, attached to that report that you get is what we call the values, beliefs, and behaviors exercise, where you pick the 3 values that are important to you. You then write down what your beliefs are about those values and what behaviors you would be exhibiting if you were living those values. And that helps to bring the values more deeply into your awareness. And once you've done that exercise, you then share your results with other people. And that interchange, when you talk about your values to somebody else, it feels like you're sharing the depth of who you really are. And you feel close to that person, even though you've never met them, because you're talking about what's really important to you.
Yeah, and I think what you said at the beginning of that as well about becoming aware of your unconscious beliefs as well is part of that process and really key.
Yeah.
And Lisa, we have another question from Lisa about if you've not got to self-expression at 40 to 49 age group, how can you catch up? So using the personal values assessment, using exercises to help uncover your personal beliefs is the practical side of what one can do. And Mark, I just want to acknowledge Mark is in the background giving us technical support. Hi Mark, and if you could add to the chat the link to the PVA, that would be really great, please.
Yeah, so the other thing was that actually my best-selling book is What My Soul Told Me. And this is a practical guide to living in soul consciousness. Yeah. So Jay will look for that while I talk about it. And this actually has lots of exercises in it about moving through the upper four stages, how individuating, self-actualizing, integrating, and serving. And so first of all, you have to learn to connect with your soul, then befriend your soul, then trust your soul, and then become one with your soul. And it's a journey. It takes time. You cannot rush it. It can take 2 or 3 decades. I've been there, I've done it. It can take a lot of time.
It's a life journey, this one.
It's a life journey.
There's also in this book mention of fourth dimension consciousness and living in the human energy field, which I just wanted to say because you referred to that, Richard, as well. So that's also in more detail in
yes,
this.
It's if you want a more popular book, not so long, What My Soul Told Me is the book to get. If you want a in-depth, more academic, then you should go to A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing.
Yep, correct. Catherine, do you evolve from your I'm just checking time. This may have to be our last question. Do you evolve from your conception of full spectrum and the evolution from ego to soul? I read that.
Okay, not quite sure of the question, but what is full spectrum? That's the first time these words have come up. So when you're able to master each stage of development, and you will feel confident, and you'll be operating from full spectrum consciousness. Now that means so higher is not better. Okay, that's a mistake that many people make. You need to be able to master every level of consciousness. In other words, at each stage of development, you need to master that stage. Otherwise, it will come back and kick you in the backside later if you haven't mastered it. So full spectrum consciousness is someone who has mastered each stage of development and can look at life calmly and deal with it, and deal with whatever shows up from a position of calm, let me put it that way. You may have 1 or 2 fears, etc., but you basically can handle whatever's going on.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm just trying to answer a few of the questions through the chat, such as what is the term maladaptive? So maladaptive schema, I'm writing that out and things like that.
Yeah, you can. You can look that up on the internet. Maladaptive. Jeffrey Young, Jeffrey with a J, EFFRAYOUNG, kind of invented this idea, or him and his colleagues.
And the other technical question was, are we familiar with the attachment theory and trauma and impact on development? Is this something we're talking about in this work?
You'll find an explanation of trauma in A New Psychology of Human Wellbeing and PTSD, and how it arises. Basically, it arises because we want to, our minds are meaning-making machines, and when we can't make meaning, it throws our minds into insecurity and instability, and it stays there until we can make meaning of it. And so that's what basically trauma is about, I believe.
Thank you, Richard, for your work. Thank you, Richard, for being here to share that with us today. And thank you, everyone, for attending, for your questions, for your presence and attention. And we wish you a very wonderful rest of your day and wherever you are in the world.